immediate wars were some of the bigger threats of war, and given that I know this session is also about climate change, about how these things begin to connect and begin to come together, because they're all, if you like, existential threats to us as people, and I think becoming bigger and bigger threats if you look on a world scale. Now, if you look at the anti-war movement, we began 12 years ago with the War on Terror, which followed the events of 9/11. And we made a very simple point then. As Sammy said, we were always told that we were wrong and that all these wars were justified. But we made a very simple point, which was that whatever people thought of 9/11 and whatever the terrible scenes that you saw and the thousands of people who died, that these wars, which George Bush and Tony Blair were launching, firstly would not end terrorism. They would make terrorism worse. And secondly, the numbers killed in New York and Washington on 9/11 would be as nothing compared to the huge casualties and instability and disruption that we've seen, that we would see if those wars went ahead. Now, it is with absolutely no satisfaction. I think everybody on this panel said these kind of things 12 years ago. Many other people said them 12 years ago. It's with absolutely no satisfaction that you have to say that every single one of the things that we said 12 years ago, 10 years ago for Iraq, 2 years ago over Libya, and in the last couple of years over Syria, that absolutely every single thing that we said has proved to be true, and everything that the politicians told us has proved to be a lie. And this is the simple fact, I think, which is behind the vote in Parliament in August this year, that meant that the MPs did what they should have had the guts to do 10 years ago when they voted, unfortunately, to take us into war in Iraq. This time, they refused to do so. And they did so because they could see the consequences of the wars, and they did so because they knew there was a massive swathe of public opinion against future wars. And that, I think, is very much to the credit of the anti-war movement, not just here but internationally, because these figures are reproduced. If you look in the United States and in other countries, you find large majorities of people oppose what is still being done, want the troops out of Afghanistan, and don't want any wars against Syria, Iran, or anywhere else. So I think that is a fantastic vindication of protest. I think the points that have been made, that if we hadn't protested, we hadn't demonstrated, there would be far more wars. The wars would have gone on longer. The British would still be in Iraq, directly occupying, as opposed to the putting in various mercenaries and oil companies and all the other things that they've been doing. They would still be there. And we would have had 2 months of a war on Syria, with countless deaths, with more and more refugees. Because the other thing that you find that every single time you look at the question of wars and the consequences of these wars, every single time we're told this is about humanitarian intervention. We're told that we cannot stand by. This is always, we can't just stand and do nothing. Whereas it has become abundantly clear that doing nothing would be a big improvement for the British government when it comes to all these wars. But we're always told people are dying, people are refugees, people are suffering terribly. All of it is true, but in every case, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, the intervention led to more deaths, led to more refugee crises. We're told that Syria is the biggest humanitarian crisis of the 21st century. That is not true. It is a terrible humanitarian crisis, but Iraq was the biggest humanitarian crisis of the 21st century, and that was caused directly by the intervention and the invasion and the occupation of the country. 4 million refugees, over 1 million people dead. All of those are the most horrific figures that we now are faced with. Now, what happened in August had a very profound effect on international politics, in my opinion. What happened was not just a vote that was won by, as Fiona says, very narrowly by 13 votes, but as a consequence of that, Obama then had to say he would go to Congress. He then realised he wasn't going to win in Congress, and then suddenly, what do we find? Well, maybe there is an alternative to war. Maybe people could sit down, maybe they could go to Geneva, maybe they could do all these things. Not wonderful solutions and not permanent solutions, any of them, but preferable to bombing people, preferable to all those sorts of things. And that is now a process which has opened up. And I think, therefore, this was a big defeat for British imperialism, big defeat for American imperialism, and it has also had the consequence of now, there are talks between the United States and Iran of a sort that haven't been going on for decades. And again, this is something that I think all of us who want peace in the world and peace in the Middle East should welcome. Having said that, I think that we are by no means out of the woods with American imperialism. I'm sure, again, probably most of you here don't think for a moment that we are, and we're going to hear about Latin America, where we know very well that there's a long history and it still continues of intervention. But I think the Americans have been very seriously set back. The right wing, anyway, hate Obama, regard him as a lame duck president, and looking forward to the next president when they can get back to having wars in various parts of the world. They're making a shift towards what they call a pivot to the Pacific. In other words, towards the possibility of wars in the Far East, and particularly they see their major rival as China. And of course, the wars won't just be conducted there. And if you look at what is happening across Africa, you see that many of there are massive amounts of American intervention in Africa in terms of bases, in terms of special forces, in terms of all these other kind of things. And this is at least partly to do with the rivalry with the Chinese, who have a great many economic interests in the area. So we are by no means seeing the end of wars. And even in the Middle East itself, where people say, well, it's much harder for them to have a war in the Middle East, that is true. But you still have the monstrous situation in the Middle East, which is the growth of the Saudis and Qataris as very, very important figures, military players as well as economic players, and particularly if you look at the Saudi military spending, has doubled in the last decade or so, and has played, both Saudi and Qatar have played a very big role in intervening and arming the opposition in Syria. You still, of course, have the continued problem of the Israelis and Palestine and the extension of the settlements, the appalling treatment of the Palestinians, repeated attempts to bomb Gaza, which we saw in 2009, which we saw again last year, and all of those things. So those are still all there. And we are going to see still instability in the Middle East and much greater rivalry in other areas as well. And that brings me to the final point I want to make about this, which is that when you look at these particular wars, they're part of a much bigger pattern. They're part of a pattern of imperial stretch in different parts of the world, but they're also part of a world which is becoming increasingly militarised. A man called Gabriel Kolko, who I would recommend anybody to read any of his books, who writes about the history of war in the 20th century, wrote about the situation that he now thinks we're in. He says, we've reached a point in human development when the nature and quantity of weaponry makes war so dangerous and destructive that surviving another century without terrible nuclear or chemical biological catastrophes remains the single greatest challenge confronting people everywhere. And that remains true. It remains true in terms of this country with its nuclear weapons, that in the Middle East, that Israel has nuclear weapons, India, Pakistan, and so on, and the United States, of course. So all of these are very, very big challenges. And a recent report from the American military itself said, where are future wars going to come from? You know, as they do, they plan, you know, we've had these wars in the Middle East, they didn't succeed, so we're going to look elsewhere. Where are these other wars going to come from? What they say is future wars will be about resources, they will be about climate change, they will be about people having to flee because they can no longer make a living because of the different circumstances as a result of climate change. They'll be due to water shortages, they'll be due to people coming to the richer parts of the world in order to escape human catastrophe, of the sort that we've seen with the terrible disasters with Africans being killed trying to get into Europe. All of them, by the way, refugees from Eritrea, Somalia, war-torn countries in Africa. That is the situation that we now find ourselves in. So just to conclude, it seems to me that the fight against war is very, very much linked to the fight against neoliberalism and capitalism, and also to the fight against climate change and the fight against imperialism. These are all part of what we have to do if we are going to build a world based on equality and justice.